The sun in the Wyoming Territory was not a nurturing star. It was a hammer, a relentless weight that beat down upon the cracked, thirsty earth until it surrendered its last drop of moisture. Under its immense, indifferent gaze, the land stretched out in every direction, a pale canvas of sagebrush and dust, broken only by the shimmering heat that rose in waves from the ground. It was a landscape that offered no comfort, no solace, only the hard truth of survival. Ilara Vance sat beside a fresh wound in that landscape. It was a small mound of earth, hastily piled and crudely shaped, not a monument to a life lived, but a stark marker of a life abruptly ended. 2 lives. Her husband, Thomas, and their 5-year-old son, Samuel. The words were a litany in her mind, a prayer with no one to hear it. Thomas and Samuel. The cholera had come upon their wagon train like a thief in the night, swift and without mercy. One day, there was the familiar comfort of Samuel's laughter and the steady presence of Thomas planning their future in the Golden West. The next, there was only fever, delirium, and a silence that was more terrifying than any scream. Now, she was a statue carved from grief. The other survivors, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and a primal fear that the sickness might yet claim them, were preparing to move on. They had offered their condolences, their words clumsy and hurried. A terrible thing, Mrs. Vance. The Lord works in mysterious ways. But their eyes darted away from hers, away from the raw, gaping hole her loss represented. They were a flock spooked by a wolf, and she was the evidence of the slaughter they were desperate to leave behind. She did not watch them go. Her world had shrunk to the space around this small patch of disturbed earth. The wagon master, a grim man named Coulter, had left her trunk beside her. The town, Redemption Creek, is a day's walk east, he had said, not unkindly. Folks there will see you right. Then he had tipped his hat and turned away, leaving her utterly alone under the vast, empty sky. Her hand rested on the worn leather of the trunk. Inside was all that remained of the woman she used to be. Books bound in fine leather, their pages filled with the poetry of a world that seemed to have never existed. A dark wool dress for a Boston winter, now a useless weight, and nestled in a velvet-lined box, a silver music box that played a tinkling, delicate tune, a lullaby. It had been a gift for Samuel. She could not bring herself to open it. To hear that melody now would be to shatter into 1,000 pieces, and she did not have the strength to put herself back together. She was a porcelain doll, once cherished, now cracked and abandoned in the dust, the fine paint of her old life flaking away to reveal the plain, fragile clay beneath. The walk to Redemption Creek was a blur of thirst and sorrow. The sun baked her skin, and the dust coated her throat. By the time the raw wooden buildings of the settlement appeared on the horizon, she was a ghost of herself, propelled forward only by some dim, animal instinct for shelter. The town was little more than a single, wide street, a muddy artery carved from the wilderness, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a handful of other rough-hewn structures stood as defiant, temporary claims against the endless plains. The people who moved along its boardwalks were hewn from the same hard material as the land itself. Their faces were weathered, their eyes sharp and assessing. When they looked at Ilara, they saw her fine, albeit travel-worn, dress, the gentle way she held herself, the quiet sorrow in her eyes, and they saw weakness. She was an outsider, a creature from another, softer world, and in Redemption Creek, softness was a liability. Her attempts to find work were met with a series of polite, yet firm, rejections that felt like stones being added one by one to the crushing weight on her heart. The woman who ran the boarding house needed someone to do laundry, but after one look at Ilara's pale, slender hands, she shook her head. "This is hard work, ma'am. Lye soap and boiling water. It ain't for delicate types." The saloon owner, a man with a stained apron and a leer in his eyes, offered her a job, but the nature of it was clear in his gaze, and she fled his establishment with a hot flush of shame on her cheeks. She was too refined, too educated, too obviously not of this place. The town's matrons, a tight circle of women who orbited the preacher's wife, the formidable Mrs. Gable, were the cruelest. They did not speak to her directly. Instead, they whispered behind their gloved hands as she passed, their voices carrying on the dry breeze. Their words were sharp as burrs, speculating on her past, judging her present. They saw a woman alone, and in their world, a woman alone was a source of suspicion, a disruption to the rigid order of things. She found lodging in a small, airless room above the general store. The proprietor, a man named Henderson, had a flicker of pity in his eyes, but business was business. The rent he charged was steep, and she watched her meager funds, the last of the money Thomas had sewn into the lining of his coat, dwindle with alarming speed. The nights were the worst. The raucous sounds of the saloon, shouting, laughter, the tinny plink of a piano, drifted up through the floorboards, a constant reminder of a world of life and vitality from which she was utterly excluded. In the darkness of her small room, she was left with nothing but the crushing weight of her silence and a solitude so profound it felt like a physical presence, a cold hand resting on her shoulder. Her grief was a constant companion, a shadow she could not outrun. Miles away, in a valley carved by a creek that ran full in the spring and trickled in the summer, Jedediah Thorne worked alone. He was a man who seemed to have been forged from the same elements as the landscape he inhabited. The sun had weathered his skin to the texture of worn leather, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held the same vast and guarded emptiness as the plains. He moved with an economy of motion born of long practice, his silence as natural to him as breathing. He was mending a fence line, stretching the wire taut and securing it to a new post he had just set. His hands, calloused and strong, worked with an expert, unthinking rhythm. He was a part of this place, his solitude a fortress he had built around himself stone by stone. The ranch, the broken T, was a reflection of its owner. It was functional, the corrals sturdy, the barn sound, but it bore the unmistakable hallmarks of a place touched by grief. The main house, built of solid timber, stood strong against the wind, but the garden that lay before it was a tangle of weeds, the ghosts of Mary's roses choked out by thistle and stubborn prairie grass. Inside, the rooms were too large, too empty. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sun, illuminating a space where life had once been. Now, it was just a shell, a place to sleep and eat before the work of the next day began. On a hill overlooking the valley, just beyond a stand of cottonwood trees, was a small, fenced-off plot of land. 2 headstones stood inside, their inscriptions softened and blurred by years of sun and snow. Mary Thorne, beloved wife and mother. Lily Thorne, our dearest daughter. Jedediah never looked directly at the graves when he rode out in the morning, but their presence was a constant, silent hum beneath the surface of his days. He lived a life of rigid routine, rise before dawn, work until dusk, eat a solitary meal, and fall into an exhausted, dreamless sleep. His interactions with others were minimal, limited to necessary trips to Redemption Creek for supplies, where his transactions were brief and his words few. He was a man locked in the past, his heart as barricaded as the land he claimed as his own. The day Alara Vance walked to the Broken T Ranch was the day her last dollar was spent. Mr. Henderson had told her, not unkindly, that she would have to be out of the room by the end of the week. The news had not sparked panic, only a dull, hollow resignation. But then she had overheard 2 men in the store talking about Jedediah Thorne. A hard man, one had said, but he sometimes hires on extra help come fall if he is in the mood. It was not hope that propelled her out of town and onto the long, dusty track leading to his valley. It was the last flicker of a desperate, dying ember. The journey was an ordeal. Her city shoes, never meant for such terrain, quickly fell apart, the thin soles offering no protection from the sharp rocks. Thorns from overgrown sagebrush tore at the hem of her dress, a fine gray muslin that was now stained with sweat and dirt. The sun was merciless. By the time she saw the ranch nestled in the valley below, she was lightheaded with exhaustion and thirst. She found him by the corral, checking the hoof of a large bay horse. He looked up as she approached, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He was taller than she had imagined, broader in the shoulder. He looked like a man who could wrestle the wildness of this land into submission. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. He straightened slowly, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her torn dress, her ruined shoes, her city-bred fragility. His eyes held no welcome, no curiosity, only a flat, hard dismissal. "I was told you might have need of some help," she began, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "I can cook, and I can sew. I am a hard worker." Jedediah dropped the horse's hoof and wiped his hands on his trousers. "I have no work for you," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. He saw her for what she was, a liability. Another mouth to feed. A fragile creature who would break under the first strain. Worse, she was a reminder of a softness, of a femininity, that he had long ago banished from his world. The sight of her, so clearly out of her element, so steeped in a sorrow he recognized all too well, was an irritation, a disruption to the sterile peace of his solitude. "Please," she whispered, the word costing her the last of her pride. "I have nowhere else to go." "That is not my concern," he said, his voice cold and final. He turned his back on her, picked up a bridle from the fence post, and began walking toward the barn, his stride resolute. The conversation was over. Defeat settled over Ilara like a shroud. There was nothing left, no fight, no tears, only a profound and utter emptiness. She turned and began the long walk back to town, though she had no idea what she would do when she got there. Each step was heavy, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. She did not look back. Jedediah watched her from the shadowy doorway of his barn. He watched her small, solitary figure recede down the long track, her posture slumped, a portrait of utter hopelessness. A bitter satisfaction warred with something else inside him, something he had tried to kill years ago. He went back to his work, the familiar motions a comfort, a way to block out the world. But from the porch of his house an hour later, he saw that she had not gotten far, and he saw the sky. The brilliant, indifferent blue of the afternoon had vanished. In its place, the western horizon was turning a bruised, violent purple. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and a sudden, sharp chill. A high plains thunderstorm was rolling in, and it was going to be a bad one. He watched her small figure hesitate, then press on, as if she could outrun the storm. A fool's hope. He remained on the porch, a stubborn sentinel, his arms crossed over his chest. It was not his concern. He had told her so himself. But his mind betrayed him. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, pierced through his defenses. Mary, his wife, her face alight with laughter as she chided him. "You have to be softer, Jedediah. You cannot keep the whole world at arm's length. Let people in." He had scoffed at her then, secure in his strength, in his ability to protect his family from any threat. He had failed. The memory that always followed, the one he fought back every single day, rose now with unstoppable force. The smoke, the screams, the sight of his home ransacked, of Mary and little Lily, gone, taken from him in a flash of brutality that had been too fast, too sudden. He had not been there to stop it. He had failed to protect them. The unforgiving wilderness had swallowed them whole. He looked out at the woman on the road, a speck against the vast, darkening landscape. He saw the same hopelessness in her posture that he had carried in his own heart for 6 years. He saw another person about to be broken by this land. With a curse that was ripped from the depths of his soul, a raw sound of fury and pain, he turned from the door, strode to the corral, and threw a saddle on his fastest horse. The first icy sheets of rain began to fall as he galloped out of the ranch yard, the wind tearing at his hat. He found her huddled under a meager outcrop of rock, shivering violently, her thin dress soaked through and clinging to her frame. Her face was as pale as bleached bone, her eyes wide with a stunned, vacant terror. The storm raged around them, a frenzy of wind and water and percussive thunder. He swung down from his horse and stood before her. She looked up at him, her expression unchanging, as if she were already a ghost. He said nothing. There were no words for this. Without a sound, he reached down, took her arm, and pulled her to her feet. She was light as a child. He lifted her easily onto the saddle, then swung up behind her, his body a shield against the driving rain. He took her back to the ranch not out of kindness or pity or any noble sentiment. He did it because he could not bear to watch it happen again. He could not stand by while the same cruel, indifferent wilderness that had taken everything from him destroyed another soul. As his horse carried them through the storm and into the shelter of his quiet, empty home, the thick walls of his isolation, so carefully built and maintained, began to show their first hairline crack. The world outside Jedediah Thorne's house was washed clean, the morning sun drawing a diamond-like sparkle from the lingering raindrops on the sagebrush. The air was crisp and cool, scrubbed free of dust by the storm, but inside the sturdy timber walls, the atmosphere was thick with a tension as heavy and suffocating as the thunderclouds that had delivered it. Ilara awoke in a small, sparse room, tucked beneath a simple quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. For a moment, she was adrift, unsure of where she was. Then the memory of the previous day crashed down upon her. The rejection, the terrifying storm, the silent, dripping ride behind the formidable man who had rescued her. The silence of the ranch pressed in, a profound and absolute quiet she had not known since leaving Boston. It was a silence unbroken by the rumble of carts on cobblestones or the distant clang of a harbor bell. Here, the silence was a living thing, vast and ancient, and it made her feel smaller and more alone than ever. She found Jedediah in the main room, which served as a kitchen and living space. He was standing by a large, black cast-iron stove, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. He did not turn as she entered, but she knew he had heard her. He gestured with his head toward the table where a plate with 2 thick slices of bread sat. "Eat," he said. The word was not an invitation, but a command. She sat, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the mug. The coffee was black and scalding hot. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of a knife as he spread a thin layer of lard on his bread and the crackle of the fire in the stove. He did not look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on a point somewhere past her shoulder, as if she were a ghost he was trying his best to ignore. "The creek will be high for a day or 2, he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Once the road is passable, I will take you back to town." The finality in his tone was a cold stone in her stomach. Her presence here was an inconvenience, a temporary shelter from a storm and nothing more. The thought of returning to Redemption Creek, to the whispers and the closed doors and the gnawing certainty of starvation, sent a wave of quiet panic through her. She had to prove she was not the useless, fragile creature he believed her to be. She had to earn her place, if only for a few more days. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I would not be a burden. Let me help while I am here." He gave a short, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if swatting away a fly. "There is nothing for you to do." But Ilara was desperate, and desperation gave her a courage she did not know she possessed. Over the next 2 days, they existed in a state of strained cohabitation, a silent battle of wills. He moved through his chores with a relentless, solitary focus, pointedly ignoring her. She, in turn, shadowed his movements, looking for any small way to make herself useful, to prove her worth. Her initial efforts were a study in failure. Accustomed to a modern Boston kitchen with its precise measurements and reliable heat, she was utterly lost before the temperamental beast that was his cast-iron stove. Her first attempt at biscuits were burned on the bottom and raw in the middle. The salt pork she tried to fry spat hot grease at her, and she flinched away, leaving it to turn into a tough, blackened strip. He ate her offerings without comment, his silence a more damning critique than any words could have been. She tried to mend one of his work shirts, the fabric coarse and stiff, patched in a dozen places with rough, functional stitches. Her own needlework, taught to her by a governess, was fine and delicate, meant for linen and silk. Her small, even stitches looked absurdly out of place on the rugged canvas of his life, a line of fine poetry scrawled on a dusty barn door. Jedediah watched her. He watched her every clumsy, ill-suited attempt to impose her foreign order on his world, and his impatience grew like a thorny weed. Her very presence was a disruption to the rigid solitude he had so carefully constructed. The house, which for years had smelled only of wood smoke, leather, and the dust of the plains, now held a new scent. It was the faint, clean trace of the lavender soap she had carried in her trunk, a ghost of femininity that called up memories he had fought for years to bury. He became harsh, his words clipped and sharp, each one a stone added to the wall around his heart. "You are holding the needle wrong," he said, his voice grating as he came in from the barn. "You will break it on that cloth." "The fire is too high," he grumbled, pushing her aside to adjust the damper on the stove. "You will burn the house down." He pointed at her ruined city shoes, which she had tried to clean but were beyond repair. "Those are useless here. You will break an ankle." Each criticism was a defense, an attempt to push her away, to make her so uncomfortable that she would be glad to leave when the time came. For Ilara, his gruffness was at first just another layer of the world's cruelty, the same hard judgment she had faced in town. Only now it was more personal, more constant. But as the days wore on, she began to see past the thorny exterior. She saw the way his eyes would sometimes linger on the overgrown garden, a flicker of something soft and sad in their depths before he hardened them again. She saw the way he would pause for a fraction of a second before a closed door down the hall, his hand almost rising to the knob before he would clench it into a fist and walk away. This was not a man filled with malice. This was a man hollowed out by a profound, aching pain, and his cruelty was only the sound of his broken pieces grinding against each other. The turning point came on the third night. A raw wind had picked up, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves of the house. Jedediah had been restless all evening, his gaze repeatedly drifting toward the barn. After their silent supper, he had simply said, "The dun mare, she is due," and had gone outside into the darkness. Hours later, Ilara was jolted from a light sleep by the sound of a curse from outside. Carried on the wind, it was raw and desperate. Something was wrong. Overcoming her hesitation, she lit a lantern and, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, stepped out into the biting wind. She found him in the barn, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. The mare was down in the hay, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain and exhaustion. The air was thick with the primal, coppery scent of birth. "What is it? What is wrong?" Ilara asked, her voice small in the vast, shadowed space. "The foal," he grunted, not looking at her. "It is turned wrong. Get out. This is no place for you." But she did not leave. She saw the fierce, desperate struggle in his posture, the strain in his muscles as he fought to help the laboring animal. This was not the cold, distant man from the house. This was someone else, someone fiercely protective, someone who battled for life against the encroaching darkness. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice firm. He finally looked at her, his eyes blazing in the lantern light. He seemed about to order her away again, but in her face, he must have seen not fear or revulsion, but a steady resolve. "Water," he commanded, his voice a sharp bark. "Hot as you can get it, and tear up some of those clean cloths in the tack room. Strips, now." For the next few hours, the world shrank to the circle of lantern light in the dusty barn. Ilara worked, her earlier clumsiness forgotten, replaced by a focused efficiency. She fetched and carried, her fear overcome by the urgency of the moment. She held the lantern steady as he worked, his low, soothing murmurs to the mare a stark contrast to his sharp commands to her. She saw the tenderness in his large, calloused hands as he tried to gentle the frightened animal, a tenderness he never showed to people, in the raw, messy, and primal scene of a life struggling to be born. They were no longer a man and a woman at odds, but a team, united in a single, desperate purpose. The struggle was long and bloody, more than once. Ilara was sure they would lose them both. But Jedediah refused to give up, his strength seeming to pour into the exhausted animal. And then, with a final shuddering groan from the mare, the foal was born, sliding out into the hay, a slick, trembling, and impossibly fragile creature. It was weak, but it was alive. A profound silence descended, broken only by the mare's soft nickering and the foal's first shaky breaths. Jedediah sank back on his heels, his body sagging with an exhaustion that was complete and absolute. He and Ilara looked at each other across the small, new life, and in that moment, the barriers of grief and suspicion and pain that had stood between them became as thin as smoke. He looked at her face smudged with dirt, her dress stained, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and weariness, and for the first time, he did not see a fragile city woman. He saw a person of unexpected, quiet resilience. He saw a woman who, when faced with the raw, brutal reality of life and death, had not flinched or run away, but had stood her ground and held the light. The next morning, the foal stood on wobbly legs beside its mother, and the tension that had filled the house was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared weariness. After breakfast, Jedediah did not tell her to prepare to leave. Instead, he cleared his throat, a rough, unused sound. "I cannot pay you in coin," he said, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table. "I have none to spare, but the ranch needs a woman's hand. If you have a mind to stay, you can have room and board, for cooking and housekeeping." He laid out his terms like a general dictating a treaty. She was to have the guest room. She was to keep to her side of the house as much as possible. She was not to ask him questions about his past. This was to be a business transaction, plain and simple, no sentiment, no friendship. Ilara felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was a cold sanctuary he was offering, a shelter with high, unspoken walls, but it was a sanctuary nonetheless. "I accept," she said quietly, "and thank you." He merely grunted in response, but she saw the slight easing of the line of his jaw. The arrangement was made. A new rhythm began. Ilara, now with a purpose, started to slowly and carefully bring life back into the neglected corners of the house. In a dusty pantry, she found a small, leather-bound book filled with handwritten recipes. Mary Thorne, it said on the inside cover in a looping, feminine script, through trial and error, following the faded ink. Ilara learned to make sourdough bread that rose, and bean soup that was thick and savory. She learned the quirks of the cast-iron stove, how to bank the coals to keep a slow, steady heat. She turned her attention to the overgrown garden. The work was backbreaking. She pulled weeds until her hands were raw, cleared away the thistle and thorns, and turned the dry, compacted soil. In this physical labor, in the act of coaxing life from the stubborn earth, she found a strange and unexpected solace. Each weed she pulled felt like a small victory against the chaos that had consumed her life. Each patch of cleared ground was a piece of herself she was reclaiming. They still ate their meals in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was less strained, more contemplative, the comfortable quiet of two people engaged in a shared enterprise. One evening, as she was washing the dishes, a wave of grief for her son, Samuel, washed over her so intensely it took her breath away. Without thinking, she began to hum the lullaby from the silver music box, a gentle, haunting melody. Across the room, Jedediah froze, a piece of harness he was mending still in his hands. The sound, so soft and unexpected, pierced through his armor like a needle. It was the song Mary used to sing to Lily when she could not sleep. He did not speak. He did not move until the last note had faded into the quiet of the house. He never mentioned it, but the shared, unspoken memory of loss hung in the air between them, a fragile, invisible thread connecting their two solitary griefs. A month after her arrival, they made a necessary trip to Redemption Creek for supplies. As they walked down the muddy main street, Ilara felt the familiar weight of the town's judgment settle upon her. But now, it was different. It was no longer tinged with pity, but with a sharp, open hostility. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, saw them from across the street and marched toward them, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She stopped directly in front of Ilara, ignoring Jedediah completely. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice loud enough for all to hear, "I am shocked, truly shocked, to see you have abandoned all sense of decency, living out there, alone with this man. It is a disgrace. You are living in sin, and you will bring God's judgment down upon this entire town." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, her hands clutching the fabric of her skirt, before she could find her voice. Jedediah stepped slightly in front of her, his large frame a sudden shield. "Mind your own business, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. As the preacher's wife stood sputtering, a carriage pulled up beside them. In it sat Silas Blackwood, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man whose land holdings dwarfed all others. He was impeccably dressed, a diamond stickpin in his cravat, his face smooth and predatory. He had been watching Jedediah's land, with its precious creek, for years. He looked from the flustered Mrs. Gable to the stoic Jedediah and the pale-faced Ilara, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his lips. "Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Having trouble? You must learn to keep your employees in line." He let his gaze linger on Ilara, insolent and appraising. "I see you have finally found yourself a new housekeeper, a much prettier one than the last, I must say." The veiled reference to his dead wife was a deliberate cruelty, a knife twisted in an old wound. Ilara saw Jedediah's hands clench into fists at his sides, a muscle twitching in his jaw. For a moment, she thought he would lunge at the carriage, but with a visible effort, he reined in his fury. "Get in the wagon, Ilara," he said, his voice tight. As they drove away from the hostile stares and whispered condemnations, the silence in the wagon was heavier than ever before. The town's prejudice was no longer a passive thing. It had become a palpable threat, a weapon being aimed at them both. It pushed them further out onto their island of isolation, forcing them to rely on one another, even as they both fought so desperately to keep their distance. Autumn arrived in the valley not as a gentle decline, but as a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The relentless heat of summer broke overnight, and a distinct chill settled into the morning air, carrying the earthy scent of drying leaves and distant wood smoke. Along the creek, the cottonwoods seemed to catch fire, their leaves turning a brilliant, trembling gold against the deep, cloudless blue of the sky. The land was shedding its skin, preparing for the long sleep of winter, and in the quiet, isolated world of the Broken Tea Ranch, the season of change was mirrored in the two solitary souls who inhabited it. The fragile truce that had existed between Jedediah and Ilara, born of necessity and a shared, desperate moment in the barn, began to slowly, hesitantly, evolve. The strict, unspoken rules of their arrangement softened around the edges, worn down by the simple, relentless rhythm of their days. The ranch itself became their shared language, a common ground where they could meet without having to navigate the treacherous territory of their pasts. Ilara was no longer the delicate, useless woman who had arrived at his doorstep. The land was remaking her, shaping her into someone new. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now tanned by the sun, the palms calloused from her work in the garden and the endless tasks of the house. She had learned to move with purpose, to anticipate the needs of the day. She knew the names of all his horses, from the steady old mare, Bess, to the fiery young gelding, Cinder. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the weather, to see the promise of rain in the shape of the clouds over the mountains, to feel the coming of a frost in the stillness of the evening air. Her confidence grew, a small, hardy plant taking root in the barren soil of her grief. For his part, Jedediah found himself slowly, almost unwillingly, emerging from the self-imposed exile that had been his prison for 6 years. The constant, quiet presence of Alara was like water seeping into the cracks of a stone, slowly wearing it down. He started speaking more, the words coming easier, no longer feeling like foreign objects in his mouth. They were small things at first, observations about the ranch, shared in a low, rumbling voice as they worked. "We will leave that field fallow next spring," he said one afternoon, as they stood by a fence line looking out over the harvested land. "The soil needs to rest. Mary always said you cannot take from the earth without giving back." It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name to her, and the word hung in the air between them, not heavy with sorrow, but with a simple, profound respect. He would point to the sky, tracking the slow, patient circle of a hawk. "Redtail," he would murmur, "hunting for field mice. He is a better mouser than any cat." Alara would listen, asking intelligent questions that showed she was not just hearing him, but understanding. Her presence, which he had once found so intrusive, had become a quiet comfort, a balm on the raw, ever-present wound of his solitude. He had grown so accustomed to the echo of his own thoughts in the empty house that the sound of her soft voice, her quiet movements, had begun to fill a space he had not even realized was hollow. As the days shortened and the nights grew longer, the dark, tragic pasts they both carried began to surface, not in torrents of confession, but in small, poignant moments that were all the more powerful for their quietness. One gray afternoon, with the threat of an early snow in the air, Jedediah came into the house to find Alara sitting on the floor beside her open trunk. Her back was to him, her shoulders slumped. In her hands, she held the small silver music box. She was not sobbing, but silent tears streamed down her face. Catching the dim light from the window, he stopped in the doorway. His first instinct, honed by years of practice, was to retreat, to leave her to her private sorrow. It was not his concern. But he did not turn away. He walked quietly into the room and stood there for a long moment, his shadow falling over her. She did not seem to notice him at first, lost in her grief. "It was for my son," she whispered, her voice thick and broken. "For Samuel. He loved music more than anything." Jedediah looked down at the delicate silver object, a thing of impossible beauty and refinement in this rough wooden house. He saw it not as a music box, but as a vessel for all the love and hope she had carried, now filled only with the bitter dust of loss. He lowered himself to the floor, not beside her, but a respectful distance away, leaning his back against the rough-hewn wall. He said nothing. He did not offer empty words of comfort or hollow platitudes about healing. He simply sat with her in the gray, silent afternoon, his solid, steadfast presence a sturdy anchor in her turbulent sea of grief. And for Alara, that silent companionship was more comforting than any words could ever be. A week later, it was Alara who stumbled upon a piece of his past. While cleaning a high, dusty shelf in the main room, her fingers brushed against a small, hard object tucked away in the back corner. She drew it out. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of soft pine, its wings slightly uneven, the knife marks still visible. Yet, there was a surprising life to it, a sense of a creature about to take flight. She held it in the palm of her hand, feeling the worn, smooth texture of the wood. When Jedediah came in for supper, she held it out to him. "I found this," she said gently. "It is beautiful." He stopped, his gaze falling on the small carving in her hand. For a moment, his face, usually a mask of stoic control, seemed to crumble. His throat worked, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion so raw it made her heart ache. "I carved that for Lily," he said, his eyes not looking at Alara but at the ghost of a memory. "For her 5th birthday. She loved the bluebirds that nested in the eaves of the barn." He swallowed hard. She never reached her 5th birthday. Alara closed her fingers around the small bird, its simple form now imbued with an almost unbearable poignancy. She could picture his large, strong hands, so capable of wrestling with wire and wood and frightened animals, working carefully to create this one small, delicate thing for his daughter. In that moment, they were no longer just a rancher and his housekeeper. They were two people defined by their losses, two souls who had seen the lights of their lives extinguished. And finally, truly, acknowledging each other's pain, they took the first, uncertain steps toward healing. It was this newfound, fragile understanding that led Jedediah to a decision. "You need to learn to ride," he announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is a practical necessity. If I was ever injured out on the range or had to be gone for a few days, you cannot be stranded here, helpless." His reasoning was sound, but Ilara's heart seized with a cold fist of fear. The thought of being atop one of those large, powerful animals, of surrendering her control to a creature of such unpredictable strength, was terrifying. Horses were a symbol of the wildness of this new world, a wildness she had not yet tamed, a wildness that had taken everything from her. He chose Bess, his calmest, oldest mare, a gentle creature with kind, intelligent eyes, but as Jedediah led her into the corral, the horse still seemed impossibly large, a mountain of muscle and bone. "I cannot," she said, her voice a small tremor. "You can," Jedediah replied, his tone firm but not unkind. He stood beside the horse, holding the bridle. "She will not hurt you. I will not let her." He cupped his hands for her foot, and with a deep, shuddering breath, she placed her shoe in them. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. As he helped her into the saddle, she was acutely aware of his proximity. His hands were strong and steady on her waist, his fingers pressing lightly into her side. She could feel the warmth of his body behind hers, smell the clean, masculine scent of leather and sweat and the outdoors that clung to him. The brief, unexpected intimacy sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the horse. Once she was settled, he kept a hand on her leg, a steadying pressure. He led the horse at a slow, deliberate walk around the perimeter of the corral. His voice was a low, steady rumble of instruction, a constant, reassuring presence in the buzzing haze of her fear. "Sit up straight, but not stiff. Let your body move with hers. Feel the rhythm of her walk. She can feel you are afraid. You have to show her you are in charge." Slowly, circuitously, Ilara began to relax. The mare's gait was smooth and predictable. The sun was warm on her back. Jedediah's calm, confident presence was a bulwark against her panic. After a while, he stopped the horse and looked up at her. "You are doing well," he said, and the simple praise warmed her. "Now, I want you to feel the change in her gait. I am going to urge her into a trot. It will be a little faster, a little bumpier. Just hold on to the pommel and move with her." He wanted to give her a sense of control, a feeling of accomplishment. But the moment his low command sent Bess into a slow, jarring trot, Ilara's fragile composure shattered. The world, which had been moving at a stately pace, was suddenly moving too quickly. The steady rhythm was gone, replaced by a series of sharp, unpredictable jolts. The feeling of control slipped away, and in its place was a sickening, terrifying powerlessness. It was a terrifying echo of the past few months, of a life that had been stable and secure one moment, and a chaotic, uncontrollable spiral the next. The cholera, the deaths, the journey, the town. It was all too fast, too much, too brutal. "Be gentle! It's too fast!" she cried out, her voice tight and high with a panic that came from a place far deeper than a simple fear of falling. The words struck Jedediah with the force of a physical blow. He froze, his hand dropping from the bridle. He hesitated. The world seemed to fall away, and his mind was flooded with a torrent of guilt and memory. He heard his wife's voice, a soft plea from a lifetime ago after a harsh argument. "Just be gentle with me." Jed. Had he been? Had he ever been gentle enough? He had been a hard man, proud of his strength, too busy building a life to appreciate the soft moments that made it worth living. And then he saw his daughter, Lily. Her small hand swallowed up in his as they ran from the house, the air filled with smoke and shouting, the flash of violence, the chaos, the end. It had all been far, far too fast. He had failed to protect them from a world that was not gentle. He saw in Alara's wide, terrified eyes a reflection of his own deepest failure, of a universe spinning out of control. For a long, terrible moment, his old instinct took over, the instinct to shut down, to retreat into the shell of gruffness that had been his only shield. A sharp, angry retort formed on his lips. He would tell her to get down, that she was hopeless, that this was a mistake. He would push her away, just as he had pushed away everything else that threatened to breach his walls. But then, something inside him shifted. He looked up at her, really looked at her. He saw not a weak woman, but a terrified one. He saw the implicit trust in her eyes, a trust that, even in her panic, was placed squarely in him to keep her safe. He had failed to keep his family safe. He would not fail again. He made a different choice. Instead of pulling back, he moved closer to the horse, his presence a sudden, solid wall. He placed a hand on her back, between her shoulder blades. His touch was firm, grounding her, but it was also incredibly, profoundly gentle. "Easy now," he said, and his voice was softer, lower, and more tender than she had ever heard it. It was a voice that gentled frightened animals and, she now realized, frightened people. "I have got you. Just breathe with her. Feel her rhythm. I am right here." He did not just slow the horse back to a walk. He moved with them, his hand never leaving her back, his calm presence a shield against her panic. He talked her through it, his instructions no longer commands but soft reassurances. "That is it. Just like that. You are safe. I will not let you fall." The moment was transformative, feeling his steadfastness, the unwavering strength and surprising gentleness in his touch. Ilara's panic slowly receded. The frantic beating of her heart slowed. She took a shuddering breath and then another, trying to match it to the rhythm of the horse and the low cadence of his voice. His hesitation, that terrible, sharp moment when she thought he would cast her aside, followed not by withdrawal but by an act of such profound, unexpected care, warmed her heart in a way she had thought was no longer possible. A warmth spread through her chest, a fragile, hopeful glow in the cold, dark place where her grief had lived for so long. It was more than a riding lesson. It was a lesson in trust, in healing. It was a moment of intense emotional intimacy that transcended the simple physical acts of their life on the ranch. As she finally found her balance, and he moved beside her, his hand still a warm, steady presence on her back. The unspoken desire that had been simmering beneath the surface of their shared sorrow finally broke through, raw and powerful and undeniably real. The gentle intimacy born of the riding lesson did not fade with the setting sun. It lingered, a tangible presence that settled into the very timbers of the small house, changing everything. The unspoken attraction, once a shy and fleeting thing, was now a constant, palpable awareness that hummed in the quiet spaces between them. The house, which had once felt cavernous in its emptiness, now seemed to shrink, charged with a new and potent energy that left them nowhere to hide from each other. They became acutely aware of the smallest details. A shared glance over the rim of a coffee mug at the breakfast table would hold for a second too long, charged with a silent question that neither dared to ask. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as she passed him a plate of food would send a jolt of warmth through her arm, leaving her skin tingling long after the contact was broken. Jedediah found his gaze drawn to the way the firelight would catch the stray strands of her hair, turning them to threads of burnished copper, and he would have to force himself to look away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. But this new, fragile awareness did not bring peace. It brought fear. For Jedediah, every flicker of warmth he felt for Ilara was a sharp stab of guilt. He was a man who had built a monument to his past, and this new feeling felt like a desecration of holy ground. He would watch Ilara moving quietly about the kitchen, her competence and gentle grace a comforting presence, and the image of his wife, Mary, would rise unbidden in his mind. The comparison was an agony. He was not just living, he was allowing his heart to thaw, and it felt like a profound betrayal. This burgeoning affection was not a new chapter, but an erasure of the old one. He felt as though he were replacing the irreplaceable, and the thought tormented him, driving him back into the cold, familiar fortress of his grief. For Elara, the nascent tendrils of hope were terrifying. She had loved once, completely and without reservation, and that love had been brutally ripped from her, leaving a wound so deep she was not sure it would ever truly heal. To open her heart again felt like standing on a cliff edge, inviting the same devastating fall. This quiet, gruff man, with his hidden gentleness and his own profound sorrow, was slowly, unintentionally, finding his way into the barricaded chambers of her heart. The thought of allowing him in, of becoming vulnerable again, was almost more than she could bear. She was not sure she had the strength to survive a second heartbreak, to piece herself together from the ashes one more time. This twin storm of guilt and fear created a painful push-pull dynamic that left them both confused and aching. A moment of intense, unspoken connection would be followed by an abrupt and jarring withdrawal. One evening, Elara had laughed, a genuine musical sound, at a stray dog that had wandered onto the porch and was performing a series of comical antics. Jedediah had found himself smiling back, a true, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. But the moment he realized it, the smile vanished, replaced by a grim line. He turned without a word and strode out to the barn, leaving her in a bewildered, wounded silence. Another day, he had come in from the cold, and she had a steaming cup of coffee waiting for him on the table. He had paused, his eyes softening with an unspoken gratitude. Seeing that look, Elara had felt a sudden panic rise in her chest, and she had retreated into a brisk formality, busying herself with chores on the other side of the room, her back rigid. They were two people reaching for each other in the dark, only to snatch their hands back the moment they felt the warmth of another's skin. This internal turmoil made them vulnerable, and Silas Blackwood, watching from his opulent ranch house like a spider in its web, could sense that vulnerability. For years, he had coveted the Broken T, not for its modest size, but for the creek that ran through it, a steady, year-round source of water that would give him absolute control over the entire valley. He had been waiting for Jedediah Thorne to break, to finally give up and sell for a pittance. Now, he saw the woman, this Boston widow, as the perfect tool to hasten that collapse. He would not attack Jedediah head-on, he would bleed him dry, a death by 1,000 cuts. The campaign of insidious sabotage began. One morning, Jedediah rode out to find a long section of his northern fence line had been cut, the wires snipped clean. A dozen head of his cattle, a significant portion of his small herd, had wandered off into the rough, open country. It took him 3 grueling days of riding from dawn until dusk to track them all down. 3 days of vital work lost as the deadline of winter approached. He returned exhausted, his face a grim mask of fury, knowing full well it was no accident. Weeks later, the second blow fell. Elara went to draw water from the well and was met with a foul, sickening stench of decay. Jedediah lowered a lantern into the deep shaft and his face hardened. A dead coyote had been thrown in, deliberately fouling their only source of clean water. The act was one of singular cruelty. With the ground already hardening in the late autumn chill, digging a new well before the first deep freeze was a desperate race against time. For 2 weeks, Jedediah worked with a frantic, punishing intensity, his body straining, his spirit eroding with every swing of the pickaxe, every bucket of earth he hauled up. Elara did what she could, bringing him food and water, her heart aching at the sight of his bone-deep weariness. These were not the acts of a common vandal, they were the calculated moves of an enemy intent on breaking him, resource by resource, hope by hope. At the same time, Blackwood unleashed his second weapon, poison, in the saloon in Redemption Creek, fueled by the whiskey Blackwood provided. His cronies began to spread vicious rumors. The stories grew with each telling, painting Elara as a woman of loose morals, a temptress who had used her wiles to ensnare the poor. Grieving rancher, Jedediah, they said with knowing winks, had lost his mind to lust, forsaking the memory of his sainted wife for the comforts of a fallen woman. The foul whispers found fertile ground in the righteous minds of Mrs. Gable and her circle. They seized upon the rumors as absolute confirmation of their initial suspicions. When Alara was forced to accompany Jedediah into town for salt and flour, the town's prejudice was no longer a matter of whispers and sideways glances. It was a wall of open hostility. The moment they stepped onto the boardwalk, conversations ceased. Women who had once offered a curt nod now gathered their skirts and crossed the muddy street to avoid walking on the same side as her. In the general store, Mr. Henderson served them with a cold, clipped formality, his eyes refusing to meet hers. She was made to feel like a disease, a carrier of a contagion so vile that the entire town recoiled from her presence. The injustice of it was a hot, bitter pill in her throat, her reputation, the only thing she had left of her old life, now in tatters. The blatant shunning infuriated Jedediah. He felt a fierce, protective anger rise in him, a primal urge to smash the smug, judgmental faces that looked upon her with such scorn. His hand rested on the handle of the axe in the back of the wagon, and it took all of his considerable self-control not to act on the violent impulse. He finished his business with a grim haste, his presence a silent, menacing thundercloud that kept the most vicious tongues at bay. But the damage was done. Alara sat beside him on the ride back to the ranch, her face pale and still, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She retreated further into the isolation of the ranch, her only sanctuary, which now began to feel more and more like a cage. The campaign of harassment reached its tragic and inevitable peak. It came on a night as black as pitch, with a sliver of a new moon offering no light and a cold wind moaning through the valley. Two of Blackwood's hired men, their faces masked by shadow, crept onto the grounds of the broken T. They moved with a stealthy purpose, their destination the large main barn. Inside was the entire supply of winter hay, the lifeblood of the herd, the result of a full summer's hard labor, and inside, sleeping peacefully in her stall, was Bess, the gentle old mare who had carried Alara on her first, terrifying ride. Jedediah and Alara were woken by a sound that would haunt their nightmares, a low, hungry roar, punctuated by a series of sharp cracks, like gunshots. Jedediah was out of bed in an instant, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. He threw open the front door and froze. The night was gone, replaced by a terrifying, dancing orange light. The barn was engulfed in flames. "No," he breathed, the word a sound of pure agony. They ran, heedless of the cold ground on their bare feet. The heat from the blaze was a physical blow, driving them back. The barn was a tinderbox, the old, dry wood and the stacks of hay consumed with an impossible speed. They worked with a desperate, futile courage, two small figures against a raging inferno. They formed a bucket brigade from the new well, a pathetic stream of water that turned to steam before it even touched the flames. They managed to drag some of the plows and harnesses from the attached lean-to, their lungs filling with acrid smoke, their eyes streaming. But the hay was lost, and then Alara remembered. "Bess!" she screamed, her voice tearing in her raw throat. "Jedediah, where is Bess?" His face, illuminated by the hellish light, was a mask of horror. He started toward the main barn door, a great gaping mouth of fire, but a section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers high into the night sky. It was too late. From within the inferno, they heard a single, terrible, high-pitched scream of an animal in mortal terror. And then, silence. The fire raged for hours, consuming everything, until all that was left was a great blackened skeleton of timbers, glowing red against the coming dawn. They stood before the smoldering ruins, two small, defeated figures covered in soot and grime, the stench of smoke and something far worse clinging to them. All hope seemed to have been extinguished with the flames. The loss of the barn and the hay was a catastrophic financial blow, a death sentence for the ranch as winter loomed. But for Alara, The death of the gentle horse was a deeply personal wound. Bess had been her first small victory against this harsh land, a symbol of her own budding courage, and now she was gone, destroyed by the same senseless, faceless cruelty that had taken her family. It was a cruel, final confirmation of her deepest fear. Anything she allowed herself to care for would be violently torn away. A single, silent tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek. Jedediah saw it. He saw the utter devastation in her eyes, the complete extinguishing of the fragile light he had watched her so carefully nurture. And in that moment, he was consumed by a crushing, absolute sense of failure. It was the same gut-wrenching failure he had felt 6 years ago, standing in the ruins of his life. He had let her in. He had allowed this fragile, beautiful thing to grow between them. And in doing so, he had placed her directly in the path of the evil that haunted his own life. He had put her in mortal danger. In a raw, grief-stricken voice that was barely recognizable, he turned to her. The last of his walls did not just go up. They slammed into place with the force of an explosion. "You have to leave," he said, his voice flat and dead. Elara stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "Pack your things. I will take you to the next town east, not Redemption Creek. You cannot stay here." He was pushing her away, not out of a lack of feeling, but from a desperate, misguided attempt to protect her from the consequences of his own life. He was cutting her out like a poison, hoping to save her from the sickness that was consuming him. "He is not after the land anymore. He is after me," Jedediah said, his voice raw with a pain that went deeper than the loss of his barn. "And as long as you are here, you are in the line of fire. I cannot—" His voice broke, and he turned his face away, unable to look at her. "I will not lose someone else." His words, meant to save her, felt like the ultimate, most cruel rejection. The fragile, beautiful thing they had built together, a shelter against their shared sorrow, lay in ashes at their feet, as ruined and desolate as the barn behind them. They were left standing in the cold, gray dawn, more alone and more broken than ever before. The morning after the fire was a bleak and silent purgatory. The rising sun, usually a promise of warmth and life, only served to illuminate the full scope of the devastation. The air was thick and acrid, an oppressive blanket woven from the stench of charred wood, wet ash, and shattered hopes. A funereal quiet had descended upon the valley, the cheerful sounds of the ranch, the nickering of horses, the lowing of cattle, replaced by an unnerving, hollow silence. In the small guest room, Elara was packing. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each folded piece of clothing a small act of surrender. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest, a dead weight of grief and resignation. Jedediah's words from the gray, smoke-filled dawn echoed in her mind, a cruel, repeating litany. "You have to leave. I will not lose someone else." She understood his fear. She saw it with a painful clarity. It was the same raw, animal terror of loss that had kept her numb for months. She recognized his retreat into a cold, hard solitude as the very same fortress he had inhabited when she first arrived. He was not pushing her away out of anger. He was trying to cauterize a wound, to cut her out of his life to save her from the fire that was consuming him. He was trying to protect her, and in doing so, he was destroying the one fragile thing they had built together. She folded her last good dress and placed it in the trunk, but as she reached for the lid, her hand stilled. Leaving. The word tasted of ash in her mouth. Leaving would mean abandoning this man to fight Silas Blackwood alone, to be swallowed whole by the darkness that had haunted him for years. But it was more than that. Leaving would be a surrender. It would be an admission that the forces of tragedy and cruelty that had stalked her across the plains had finally won. The cholera, the graves on the prairie, the scorn of the town, the fire, they were all pieces of the same brutal fist, and leaving would be to bow her head and accept its final, crushing blow. Something inside her, a part of her she thought had died with her son, refused. A quiet, unyielding strength began to rise from the depths of her despair. She had been a victim long enough. She had been blown by the winds of fate, a broken doll cast aside in the dust. No more. She slowly straightened up. She took the folded dress from the trunk and placed it back in the small wardrobe. She was not leaving. She found Jedediah where she knew he would be, standing in the heart of the ruins. The barn was a blackened skeleton, its charred ribs reaching toward the pale sky like a desperate, unanswered prayer. He was sifting through the wreckage with a pitchfork, his movements aimless, his broad shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. He was not looking for anything salvageable. He was simply moving through the motions of a man who had lost his purpose. He did not hear her approach over the soft crunch of ash under her boots. She stood behind him for a moment, gathering her resolve. "I am not leaving, Jedediah," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning's bleak silence with the clean, sharp edge of a new blade. He stopped, his back still to her, the pitchfork held limply in his hands. "There is nothing to discuss. Elara, I will take you to Cheyenne. You will be safer there." "No," she said, stepping closer, until she stood beside him in the ashes of their shared hope. "You think sending me away will keep me safe? You think you can protect me by locking yourself away with your ghosts, but you are wrong." He finally turned to look at her, his face haggard, his eyes hollowed out by grief and lack of sleep. "You do not understand what you are saying." "I understand perfectly," she said, and her voice gained a new, unshakable strength, a power she did not know she possessed. "A man like Silas Blackwood, he has already taken everything from me. On that trail, I lost my husband, my child. I lost my future. I lost the woman I used to be. The world I knew was burned to the ground long before this barn. The only thing I have found since then, the only fragile glimmer of hope is here, in this valley, with you." She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. "I will not let him take this from me, too. And I will not let your fear take it from me either. Your ghosts are not stronger than we are, Jedediah, and neither is Silas Blackwood." Her words struck him with more force than any physical blow. He looked at her, truly saw her, and for the first time, he did not see a delicate woman he needed to protect. He saw an equal. He saw a partner, her spirit as tempered and as resilient as forged steel, willing to stand and fight beside him, not behind him. Her resolve, born from the depths of her own unimaginable loss, broke through the thick, suffocating fog of his despair. It was a hand reaching for him in the darkness, and he finally, tentatively, reached back. This was their true commitment, a vow made not before a preacher in a church, but spoken in the ashes of their home, sealed by the shared certainty that they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. A new, grim purpose settled over them. They could not win by simply enduring Blackwood's attacks. They had to fight back. Jedediah knew that Blackwood's power was absolute in Redemption Creek. The local sheriff, a lazy, complicit man named Barlow, was squarely on his payroll. To go to him would be to sign their own death warrants. They needed proof, irrefutable proof of Blackwood's crimes, and they needed to take it to someone beyond his reach. Their first stroke of luck, the first sign that they were not entirely alone, came 3 days later. A young man approached the ranch at dusk, his manner furtive, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. His name was Caleb, a boy barely out of his teens, with a thin, honest face and work-roughened hands. He had worked for Silas Blackwood until a month ago. "Mr. Thorne," he said, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "What Blackwood did, it was wrong. I cannot live with it." Over a cup of coffee at the kitchen table, Caleb's story tumbled out. He had been fired for refusing to take part in a scheme to rebrand stolen cattle, racked with guilt and simmering with resentment. He confirmed what they already knew in their bones. Blackwood had ordered the fire. He had overheard 2 of Blackwood's most trusted men, a pair of hardcases named Finch and Dobbs, bragging about the bonfire at the Broken T. But Caleb gave them more than confirmation. He provided crucial, actionable intelligence. He told them of Blackwood's long-standing practice of rustling unbranded cattle from the open range and altering the brands on strays from other ranches. He knew their methods, their timing, and most importantly, he knew where they kept the stolen herd before moving them to market, a hidden box canyon deep within Blackwood's vast property, a place easily defended and almost impossible to find by accident. He is getting ready to move a big herd east in a week or two, Caleb finished, his voice low, before the snows. Armed with this knowledge, a dangerous plan began to form, while Jedediah and Caleb, under the cover of night, would make the perilous journey onto Blackwood's land to gather physical evidence, locating the canyon. Documenting the altered brands, Ilara would take on a different, but no less significant, risk. Her whole life in the West, her refined, educated background had been a mark against her, a sign of weakness and foreignness. Now, she would turn it into a weapon. While the men rode, she would write. She would bypass Sheriff Barlow, Redemption Creek, and all of Blackwood's local influence, and write directly to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. For 2 days, she worked at the small wooden table, the scratching of her pen the only sound in the quiet house. With a meticulous, damning clarity, she laid out the entire campaign of terror. She detailed the cut fences, the poisoned well, and the final, catastrophic act of arson. She included Caleb's sworn, signed statement, his testimony a nail in Blackwood's coffin. Her prose was not emotional or overwrought. It was clear, compelling, and devastating in its logic. It was a gamble, a desperate plea for a justice that might exist beyond the corrupt confines of their small world, a hope that the power of carefully chosen words could be as potent as a loaded gun. Jedediah rode to the next town east, a full day's journey, to post the letter, ensuring it would not pass through the hands of Blackwood's cronies in Redemption Creek. The wait was agonizing. Jedediah and Caleb made 2 successful forays onto Blackwood's land, confirming the location of the canyon and the stolen herd. But their actions had not gone unnoticed. An informant in town must have warned Blackwood that Thorne was not broken, but was fighting back. Realizing his slow campaign of attrition had failed, Blackwood decided to end things permanently. The attack came just as they had anticipated it would. On a cold, clear night, Blackwood and his 2 enforcers, Finch and Dobbs, rode toward the broken T. They were not coming to talk. They were coming to kill Jedediah Thorne, burn his house to the ground, and erase the woman who was the source of his newfound strength. But Jedediah and Caleb were ready. They had set a trap. Caleb was hidden in the rocks above the main approach to the house, a rifle in his hands. Jedediah waited in the deep shadows of the porch, his own Winchester ready. The confrontation, when it came, was not a clean shootout in the middle of a street. It was a desperate, brutal fight for survival on their own ground. The first sign of the riders sent a jolt of adrenaline through the cold night air. The fight exploded in a chaos of rifle shots, shouting, and the terrified whinnying of horses. Jedediah, fueled by 6 years of suppressed rage and the desperate, primal need to protect Ilara, fought with a cold ferocity that Blackwood and his men had grossly underestimated. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a man defending his last reason to live. From his vantage point, Caleb managed to wound Dobbs, forcing him to take cover. Finch, a hulking, brutal man, dismounted and charged the house on foot. Ilara, watching from the window as instructed, saw with horror that Finch was flanking Jedediah, who was pinned down by Blackwood's covering fire. She was not a passive damsel waiting for rescue. With a surge of desperate courage, she acted. She ran to the small pile of signal wood they had prepared by the side of the house, a prearranged diversion, and threw a lit lantern into it. The dry wood caught instantly, a pillar of flame and smoke erupting into the night, momentarily drawing the attacker's attention. In that split second of confusion, Jedediah moved, but Finch was still coming, a pistol in his hand, his eyes fixed on Jedediah's position. He was too close. He would reach Jedediah before he could reload. Without a second thought, Ilara grabbed the heaviest, most solid object she could find, the large cast-iron skillet from her kitchen. She burst out the back door, circling around the house as Finch closed in on the porch from the other side. He was focused only on Jedediah, a fatal mistake. With a strength born of pure terror and adrenaline, Ilara swung the heavy skillet with all her might, catching the big man squarely on the back of his head. He dropped like a sack of stones, his pistol clattering on the hard-packed earth. The tide had turned. Dobbs, seeing his partner fall and unnerved by the signal fire, scrambled to his horse and fled into the darkness. Now it was only Blackwood and Jedediah. The fight culminated near the bluffs that overlooked the dark, sleeping valley. It ended not with a clean shot, but with a desperate, grunting struggle in the dirt. Both men were exhausted, trading clumsy, brutal blows. Blackwood, his face a mask of furious hatred, lunged at Jedediah with a knife. Jedediah sidestepped, grabbing Blackwood's arm. They stumbled together, locked in a final, grim embrace, their feet slipping on the loose rock at the cliff's edge. With a final, desperate heave, Jedediah broke free. Blackwood, his balance gone, his face a silent scream of shock, teetered for a half-second on the precipice before plunging backward into the darkness. The sound of his body hitting the rocks far below was a sickening, final thud. A profound silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the signal fire and the ragged, desperate gasps of Jedediah Thorne. Standing alone at the edge of the world, the violent end had come, delivered by the very land Silas Blackwood had sought to steal. In the immediate aftermath, a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight descended upon the Broken T Ranch. The echoes of the gunshots faded into the vast, star-dusted sky, and the crackle of the signal fire seemed a profane intrusion on the sudden, unnatural peace. The air was cold and thin, tasting of gunpowder and fear. Jedediah stood at the edge of the bluff, his ragged breaths tearing at the quiet. Ilara moved toward him, her legs unsteady. In the yard below, Caleb, his face bruised and his arm bleeding from a ricochet, was grimly tying the hands of the unconscious man Ilara had felled with her skillet. He was alive. They were all alive. The reality of it, the sheer, brutal fact of their survival, began to sink in, and it was a chilling, heavy thing. Jedediah was not looking at the valley, but inward, into the abyss that had just opened at his feet. He had taken a man's life, even a man as evil as Silas Blackwood, a man who had brought nothing but poison and pain into his world, was now dead by his hand. It was not a victory. It was a terrible, soul-heavy burden. He felt the ghosts of his wife and daughter stir, and he wondered if they would recognize the man he had just become. Ilara reached him, her hand coming to rest gently on his arm. He flinched, not from her touch, but from the raw, jangling state of his own soul. She said nothing, simply turned him away from the cliff's edge and guided him back toward the house, back toward the small circle of light that was their home. Inside, the warm air of the kitchen felt like a different world. She gently pushed him into a chair and brought a basin of water and clean cloths. As she began to tend to a shallow cut on his forehead, her touch was gentle and infinitely reassuring. He had fought to protect her, and now she was here to mend him. In this raw, vulnerable moment, with the adrenaline of the fight ebbing away to leave them both trembling and exhausted. The last of the walls between them did not just crumble, they evaporated as if they had never been. He looked up at her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide and dark with all they had just seen, and he saw a strength that mirrored his own. She looked at him, at the deep weariness in his eyes, the tremor in his strong hands, and she saw the profound vulnerability he had hidden for so long. Without a word, he reached up and covered her hand with his. They clung to each other then, not as a man and a woman in the first flush of love, but as two survivors who had walked through the absolute worst of the darkness together and had, somehow, found their way out to the other side. That night, in the profound quiet of the house, they finally gave in to the love and desire that had grown between them, a hardy, stubborn plant in the barren soil of their grief. It was not an act of frantic passion born of a violent victory. It was an act of profound, aching tenderness. It was a quiet, deliberate affirmation of life in the face of so much death. In the soft lamplight, every touch was a reassurance, every kiss a mending. They were reclaiming their bodies from the cold grip of sorrow, reclaiming their hearts from the ghosts that had held them captive for so long. For the first time in years, they were not just surviving, they were living. The arrival of the territorial marshal 2 days later brought the conflict to its official and final close. Marshal Thompson was a man well past his prime, with a weary slump to his shoulders but a gaze as clear and honest as the Wyoming sky. He had received Ilara's letter and had ridden from Cheyenne with 2 deputies, expecting to investigate a complaint, not to walk into the aftermath of a small war. He listened to their story with a patient, discerning silence. He examined the ruins of the barn, the fresh graves of the horses, and the bullet holes in the side of the house. He took Caleb's straightforward, unwavering testimony. He interrogated the captured henchman, Finch, who, facing a hangman's noose, confessed to everything: the rustling, the sabotage, and the final, murderous attack, implicating Blackwood in a long and sordid history of crime. Jedediah led the marshal and his deputies to the hidden canyon, where they found the stolen herd, the altered brands a clear and damning testament to Blackwood's greed. Standing on the bluff where Blackwood had met his end, Marshal Thompson surveyed the scene, his expression grim. His final report was concise. Blackwood's death was ruled as an act of self-defense. Finch was taken into custody to face trial. The reign of Silas Blackwood over the valley was, at long last, over. The news sent shockwaves through Redemption Creek, with Blackwood's corrupting influence gone, and the authority of the territorial marshal backing the story. The carefully constructed facade of the town began to crack. People who had lived for years under the thumb of Blackwood's intimidation, too afraid to speak out, now found their voices. Stories of stolen land, usurious loans, and veiled threats began to circulate, painting a picture of a tyrant who had held the entire community hostage. In this new, clearer light, the town's perception of Ilara and Jedediah began to change dramatically. They were no longer the scandalous outcasts, the subjects of salacious gossip. They were the courageous individuals who had stood up and said no more. Justice in a place like Redemption Creek was not a loud, triumphant affair. It was a quiet, gradual mending, a slow rebalancing of the scales. The most potent symbol of this shift came a week later. In the aisle of the general store, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stood before Ilara, her face flushed, her hands twisting the strings of her handbag. For a long moment, she said nothing, the air thick with all the unspoken cruelties of the past months. "Mrs. Vance," she began, her voice a stilted, unfamiliar murmur. "It appears we were mistaken. What you and Mr. Thorne endured, it was a great injustice. I hope you can accept my apology." It was not eloquent, but it was genuine. Ilara, seeing the shame and humility in the older woman's eyes, simply nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice soft. "I do." A few days later, a wagon arrived at the ranch, carrying 3 of the town's men. They had come, they explained awkwardly, to offer their help in clearing the wreckage of the barn. The next day, another wagon came, with more men and a load of fresh-cut timber. It was a communal effort, a silent, hard-working apology from a town trying to heal itself. Ilara and Jedediah accepted the help with a quiet, unadorned grace, understanding that healing, for a community as well as for a person, takes time and shared labor. With the external threats gone, their focus turned inward, toward the future. They worked side by side, from sunup to sundown, to rebuild the barn. Their actions were imbued with a sense of shared purpose and a hope that felt as real and solid as the timber in their hands. The ranch, once a place of solitary grieving for Jedediah, a monument to his loss, began to transform. Ilara's garden, which she had so painstakingly cleared and tended, began to flourish under her care, its rows of green shoots and bright blossoms bringing color and vibrant life to the stark landscape. The house, once so silent and empty, filled with the sounds of easy conversation and, on occasion, the soft, surprising sound of shared laughter. It was no longer a shelter, it was a home. One clear, cool afternoon, they walked hand in hand up the hill to the small, fenced-off plot. They stood before the two weathered headstones of Mary and Lily, and for the first time, Jedediah spoke of them without the raw edge of pain in his voice. He shared memories with Alara, of Mary's terrible singing voice, of Lily's fascination with grasshoppers, of small, happy moments that had been buried for too long under the weight of their tragic end. He was not clinging to the past, but integrating it, honoring it as part of the man he had become. In turn, Alara spoke of Thomas and his unwavering belief in the promise of the West, of Samuel and his bright, curious mind. She found that speaking their names no longer brought just the sharp, stabbing pain of loss, but a sweet, gentle melancholy, the quiet ache of a love that endures. They were not replacing their lost loved ones. They were simply, bravely, making new room in their broken and mended hearts for a new and different kind of love. The story concludes in the full glory of the following spring. The new barn stood tall and sturdy, its fresh pine scent a testament to their resilience. The valley was a carpet of green, dotted with the bright, cheerful faces of wildflowers. The creek ran full and clear, and the air was filled with the promise of a new season. One evening, as they were clearing away the supper dishes, Jedediah took a small object from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was a ring, a simple, unadorned band that he had fashioned himself from a bent silver coin, hammered and polished until it shone with a soft, warm light. He did not get down on one knee or speak with flowery, poetic words. He simply took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I registered the brand in Cheyenne last week," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It is the Thorn Vance Ranch now." He looked into her eyes, and in their clear depths, she saw the whole of their shared future. "Alara, build this life with me." She accepted without hesitation, her quiet yes the only word needed. He slipped the simple band onto her finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged. The final scene finds them on the porch of the house they had fought for, rebuilt, and made their own. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. A deep, peaceful quiet settled between them, a comfortable silence born not of emptiness, but of a complete and perfect understanding. The wild, harsh landscape that had once seemed like an enemy, a cruel and indifferent force, no longer felt threatening. It was simply home, their love, born from the darkest of tragedies, forged in fire and fear, had become their shelter, a quiet, enduring light that had overcome all prejudice and darkness, proving, in the end, that even in the most broken of hearts, hope can take root and bloom. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are from so we can all connect. Subscribe to our From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.